Okay, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here in one of the first universities. And you know, I'm from my first education, I'm a historian of medieval history. So basically, when I heard about Bologna, I was a little bit not scared, but very inspired by the idea of coming to Bologna and to Farli and to see the place. So, and to have a possibility to be here. As you see, the topic is quite broad. I would understand if you. Okay, we can just start. Maybe, and then we understand on which base we are. What do you think you can see here?
Then maybe a queue of people fleeing from Kiev.
Yeah, okay, so basically our story starts here at the end, so it's late February, basically in Kiev, so the war started and people flee from Kiev, and at the same time in Russia we have a process against Memorial because Memorial was liquidated right before the war was started. But the connection is with the history of World War II is quite evident and still quite surprising. So never knew the war will start and never anticipated the start of the war. But when the war started, everything began to be very clear because several months before the war, Putin issued an article about history. He's a historian, of course. That's a joke. About Ukrainian statehood and the history of Ukrainian statehood, with the main ideas that Ukraine wasn't state at all. So it's basically a construct made by Bolsheviks. So it's not a state, it's a mistake. Next slide. We'll give you some insight about state propaganda in Kherson. So that's, how many of you can read Russian? Okay, okay. Maybe you can translate both slogans. Yeah, and the second, it's okay. We will try to achieve demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. So basically, that was the main idea behind the war, to end World War II, as Putin understood it, and to do with the Ukraine basically the same things which were done by occupation forces in Germany. Two words, demilitarization and denazification, are words coming from 1940s. It's called 3D, denazification, demilitarization, and decentralization. That were the tasks of Allied forces on the occupied Germany, occupied territory of Germany. So this thing can be, it was made by intent, of course. So because for decades, the idea that Russia is the state which bears all on its shoulders all the ideas of World War II, and the state which was the only victorious state in World War II, and the state which continues the traditions which helped USSR to win the war. This idea was kind of juice of Russian ideology for decades before the war. And this ideology was used to justify the attack on Ukraine and to to justify the attack on Ukraine. But where is it? I think everybody understands. Yeah, that's Moscow. That's one of the one of the parade on the Victory Day on the 9th May. So it's the main event of Russian cult of the war, which is how it calls many researchers. Cult of the war, which started in the which was renewed in the mid-90s with the 50th anniversary of the victory, and then begins the main ideology of Putin state. Why do you think can it be so the idea of renewing and recreating the events of past years of World War II? Why is it, could it be so useful for the ideology? Would I ask you? Why is it, can it be so important?
Maybe because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was kind of delusion.
Disappointment.
There's disappointment.
Mm-hmm.
So to kind of boost national pride after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the idea of pride for your state. Yeah, true. Maybe some other ideas.
To revive the imperial feelings that they had under Soviet Union and to re-evoke them during the current day Russia times.
Mm-hmm. This is, I would agree, but we need to clarify the terms. Soviet Union never proclaimed itself an empire. So basically, this idea of that Soviet Union is empire is quite Western concept.
I know, but maybe in the effects.
Yeah.
It was, and I don't know how to explain myself, but maybe I don't know the rituals of Soviet Union in this sense because I'm not an expert, but maybe they already had some kind of exaltation of their power. Even if they didn't present it as an imperial power, they still had something like that, and maybe this is a revocation of those.
You mean the pride for great power status?
Yeah, exactly, more or less. Like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Maybe some more.
With this like vivid thing like happening every year, so people are more prone to refer to those ideas and to make them actual and to use them in nowadays like present instead of being just the past.
Mm-hmm. So reenactment of the past as a way to unite people now. One of the
yeah, and to make them ready to kind of fight again.
This is it's very good idea because so every idea is good, but this is what really happened in the Donbas region since 2014, because the people who were whose hobby was reenactment of historical events finally became the leaders of anti-Ukrainian forces in Donbas region, and that's how it works. So basically, you absorb the ideology. With this reenactment, you absorb the ideology, and finally, when you see the point on which you can use this absorbed ideology, for example, to proclaim Ukrainian as a fascist state. Okay, good. So they are fascist. We fought with the fascists for our life, and yeah, now it's a good way to continue, but not in the as a performance, but as a reality. Yeah, maybe some more ideas. That's also, I would add, you may basically you told all the main things, but I would add a bit more. The war was a kind of unification between the people, so-called people, and so-called state. Stalin used the war as a way to get rid of heavy burden of collectivization, of repression, and to present himself as a leader of the nation and as a leader of one big family. When the war started, for a week he was somewhere outside. No one knew what's with him, because and historians think that he was in a really bad psychological conditions, because he was sure that Hitler will not attack so early. But when he came out of his so-called exile, he came with the speech, which started as brothers and sisters. So the idea of unification, of gathering, of friendship between state and normal people, that's what this idea is in the heart of idea of victory, because victory was made by the people and by the state together, and that's a very important concept right now. Because, and that's the next question, because many other ideologies were failed in modern Russia. For example, the 90s were the ideas of since late 80s, the ideas of liberalization, of making new national state in Russia. It was failed. Why? Because people didn't get it. And Putin, when he came to the power, he begins with comparison between him and his rule and so-called wild 90s. And all the ideological concepts which were important for the 90s were put away. For example, liberal democracy, liberal movements, the idea of capitalism as a way to establish a good and justify social state. It was put away, and instead of this, a new idea of national, of nostalgia for Soviet times and of nostalgia for the, you told it, empire. I'm not sure that's the word, but still it's a word which came on mind when we talk about it. So basically the state and Putin took the ideology which was held before by the communists. Putin, as when he won the election, the second place was Zyuganov, the head of Communist Party, and the Communist Party used this resentment of Soviet times to get more support by ordinary people, and then somehow Putin make it work for him. So not the communists are the really heirs of Soviet power, but we are the states. And that's kind of political game, which also includes the game of so the game with the code of war. To show you how it works, it's I think it's photo from 2012. Could you maybe explain what's on it?
Stalingrad?
Yeah, good. But not only Stalingrad, Stalin himself. And that's quite a tricky thing because it's really it's a vernacular thing. It's not that state did put Stalin on the top of this smaller bus. Stalin began to be a very popular figure as a result of this resentment for Soviet past. But when and it was in the early 2010s, and it was a question: should somehow state support this trend to legitimization of the figure of Stalin as head of the nation, as a good head of the nation, or not? Should it support, for example, the ideas of renaming Stalingrad, Volgograd, nowadays Volgograd, the place of one of the most important battles in World War II, into Stalingrad, or not? That was huge discussions, and finally it was quite a clever decision not to rename, but for example to rename it for a few days. So now Volgograd can be called Stalingrad on few days a week in a year, when the events of Stalingrad battle are commemorated. But this is quite political thing, and in different regions it works with in a different style. For example, here we see it's somewhere, I don't really know from which region it is, but when so-called Stalinobus, that means the bus with the Stalin on its with the Stalin. When they came to Caucasus regions, it was quite a huge resistance against it, because Stalin is not the hero of Caucasus nations because of the deportations of Chechen and Ingush after the war as enemies of the state, as a nation, collaborative nations. But still, somehow state played on this area to get the profit out of this resentment ideas. And this is another way of getting some things which come from which were made as a grassroots. It's called immortal
Regiment.
yeah, good, thank you. Immortal regiment. You know the idea. I think you can explain it better than me. Yep.
Well, the concept is
The
concept is that people bring photographs of their relatives who died in World War II or participated in World War II. And they just take their photographs and attach them to a stick and then march together as some kind of military formation in a way. But it's been co-opted by the state, which you're probably going to talk about.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. So basically, you explain the idea, but I would add here one point, that most of these people are it's not the strangers on these plates. It's the people from your family. So, and that is in contrast to this kind of events, when we talk about big concepts, victory, Stalin, and so on. But this movement started as a private movement of family memory, inspired by family memory about people who fought during the war, and that's basically their relatives who are walking with these plates across the streets. And yes, for 1 year it was evolved as an independent initiative, but for the next year it was co-opted by the state and made. It was first. First, it was made in Tomsk. It's a city in Siberia, in eastern Siberia. But next year it was made nationwide and with the huge support of the state. And basically now that's the state offices who print this. So the family memory begin to be one part of a state memory, and this movement of Moscow is a place where the political speeches are also pronounced. So it is how it works. So basically, the state approved all the ideas connecting to the victory, connecting to the war, and present itself as heirs to this victory. And this is made because of all other ideologies which could unite people were failed because of, I think, because of 90s, but we can discuss it later. Okay. What is also interesting that, of course, even this part of nowadays memory about the war and victory, and of course this part too, they are quite in contrast to the very complicated and deepen work with the memory of the war in Soviet culture. And of course we can now, from nowadays perspective, we can think of Soviet culture as a way, as very with a lot of censorship, with a lot of omitted things which you can tell publicly, and of course it's true. But we can also think of it in very different ways. So, for example, many of the topics which were later presented as more or less omitted were in the Soviet culture and the Soviet memory of war. And this memory was also grown up on a real memories of the veterans and the people who were somehow involved in the events of World War II. This is a poster of a movie about Ostarbeiters, which were filmed right after the end of the war. It wasn't shown nationwide. It was mostly presented in Ukrainian. And Ostarbeiters, maybe you can explain me who are the Ostarbeiters? Forced laborers during the World War II. So, okay, it will be just small marginalia. So when Germans came to the occupied territories, of course, most of the men of German men were engaged into. So the German industry needed workforce, and in order to provide this workforce, there was a huge campaign to invite people from occupied territories to Germany to work there. In Soviet Union, this campaign wasn't very well done in terms of propaganda. And then when they understand that it doesn't work, people don't came to Germany to work as a volunteer, they forced people to go, and that's a kind of and these people went to Germany, worked there also in military factories, and then when the war ended, they returned to Soviet Union. And of course, for many of Soviet citizens, these people were the enemies, because they made by their own hands, they made the bombs which finally ended its existence on Soviet territory. It was one idea, and the second idea that while people on the occupied territories were witnesses how front twice. So they had first they were under Soviet rule, then under German rule, then back under Soviet rule, and with a lot of devastations of the territory, with a lot of atrocities. These people were lived in Germany in more or less not the good, but the conditions on which you can exist. And that's why the Ostarbeiters as a group of victims wasn't very presented in Soviet narration, but it is important that the movie was filmed and the movie was shown, but in Ukrainian, as I told, because in Ukrainian, most of the Ostarbeiters came from Ukrainian territories. I don't think you have an idea who is it, but it's one of the most prominent writers, Soviet writers about the war. It's Vasil Bykov, and he was also one of the most filmed. So his works were one of the most filmed and by the Soviet and later by the nowadays Russian film directors. Why? Because he in his small novels he shows the moral ambivalence of many things. So it's not about the heroes. It's about ordinary people on the war, and it's about moral dilemmas which came by the war. And this is one of so it's from the movie from the 60s, made by out of his novel of Vasil Bykov's novel. It's called Ascension, and it's what is interesting, and maybe you can see it here. I didn't. It's full of religious symbolic. So basically, in the 60s, you have not only literature dealing with moral dilemma. You have movies which are which absorb the religious feelings of Russian during the war, and it has a lot of allusions towards the crucifixion. There is Iuda there, Judas, also kind of Judas is there. It wasn't in Vasil Bykov's novel, but it is here. And this, what is interesting in this memory, it was made out of real stories of real people. And a new propaganda, new call of war is mostly based on the documents and don't have a person as its core, and that's one of the most interesting thing which when we talk about Putin's idea of war, it is about documents, it's about glory, and that's why this initiative was so important. This at least works with the family memory, but mostly it's about with this very nationalist concepts of war, and they did a great job. Nevertheless, they did a great job. This is there was two very important for all of us, for all Russians, I would say, initiatives in publishing archival documents. The archival documents of Ministry of Defense, and these archival documents help you to trace the story of your relative and basically of so you can find basically anybody who was participated in the army here, and to trace where he was, where he fought, when he died. But in the second, you see, maybe you can translate. What's the name of this database? It's so it's not about memories. It's not about. It's only about how we won. So, and it's about the glory of each person. And here I will provide some example from, and this affects the memory, and this affects the way of discourse of this memory. And here I will provide an example from memorial work. For 20 years, there was a school contest of memorial men in history. It was one of the biggest in Russia. Around 2,000 essay made by the school pupils about the history of their family, about the history of the repressed relatives, and history of their communities. And from year to year, from the 1999 till 2019, the topic of World War II became more and more popular. So, of course, it was popular in the beginning, but at the end, in the 2019, we had at least 2/3 of these essays made about the relatives, about their so-called glorious way of victory. And most of these are very standardized because they are made using these documents. Then adding some heroic narration, of course, without any oral history evidences, no research at all. So basically, it's how now the war is perceived, because it's not about what your grand or grandfather told you, but it's only based on these documents and on this idea of glorious victory, glorious narration. And this is why this cult of victory can be used very well, because you already don't have anything behind it. You don't have any reflections behind it. You have very established narration and very which is also based on the it's based on the documents, but it is quite empty in terms of your own reflections and memories of your relatives and your family memory. Okay. But of course, in both in the Soviet Union and in nowadays Russia, some of the topics were omitted. I told you before quite detailed about Ostarbeiters, and I will come to this topic a little bit later. But as you see the map, it's basically the most, it shows how far German troops advanced to Soviet Union. It is around 40% of European part of Soviet Union were occupied, and on these territories before the war lived around 45% of the population. And most of this territory were occupied since 1939, then 1941, till 1943 or 1944 even. So it's several years of living under occupation of the huge part of Soviet population. But this the topic of living under occupation was underrepresented in Soviet Union, and is still underrepresented. The most of the museums narrated about the victims of concentration camps, about the victims of German atrocities, but of course you understand that like 3 years of coexistence is not only the atrocities, and only several movies, several Soviet movies tell about connections between German and Soviet people. Of course, it's not the topic in the literature, more or less. Maybe you can correct me because it's but still it's kind of omitted topic. Why? Because it has a lot of question. It's quite strange thing, and I would say one museum, one state museum, which highlights this topic and shocked me once. It's in Rzew, the place where the longest battle was. So it's 2 or 3 years. Soviet troops and German troops stand one behind each other, one in front of each other, and nothing happened. And the small territories in between has this strange feeling of they don't know who is better, because Soviet army bombs Soviet citizens, so people who are under occupation. German bombs the Soviet part, and in the museum you see the ambivalence, and the two forces were represented as the same, which is not the topic for the most of the museum, because of course people in the occupation should wait for Soviet, so for the so-called liberation, and so on. So the topic of occupation is of course underrepresented, and also I will come back to Ostarbeiters. After the movie I told you before, filmed in the 40s, this was the book of 1978 first, dealing with the fate of one person, Ostarbeiters, who were taken to Germany, and this is it's a novel about growing up, of course, and that makes it good novel. But in order to publish it in 1978, Vitaly Semin, the writer, should go through many obstacles because of censorship and because this topic was unpleasant, and it works with family memory too. So when the topic is underrepresented in the culture, when the topic is not prestigious topic in the society, the connection between generations, the translation of the memory between the generation begins very strange and heavy thing. This is from our archive. Just small story behind it. It's quite interesting. A person who sent it to us, he said, you know, I have some documents and send it to you. Can't read it, but I can tell you the story of my mom. So she was taken to Germany during the World War II, and she spent several years in concentration camps. And then she get back. She was accused in collaboration, but some of soldiers, some witnesses that she never collaborated. So the accusation was lifted. Yeah, and we were born in Germany. We were also in these camps, but I can't remember anything about it. And he sent the document. Some of you maybe can read German. No. So when I read the documents, it's something like it was shocking. That's the evidence that she applied for German citizenship for her and her family, and she get it. So basically, the person who told us the story about concentration camps and who can't read this this document, he was basically German citizen. Why it was possible? Because she was so-called Volksdeutsche. She was German. She from German family, lived for like decades in Russia, and then the Germans came. Volksdeutsche could apply for citizenship, and of course they will not. They weren't in the concentration camp. They worked on the factory. Finally, we get all the stories. They worked on the factory, yes, but with German citizenship and in quite good conditions. But it's something which don't. This memory, these facts, they won't translate from one generation to another. So her son didn't know German. She knew. Her son thought about the concentration camp because it's very common group of victims. Of course, it's quite easy to represent yourself as a victim of concentration camp and not as a German citizen. And he even forget the language. And that was the case of fading memory of the war in Soviet Union. The same case, of course, it's the same is true about the political repressions, because never wanted to get the memory of their own father and mothers about being in Gulag camps, and never wanted to repeat it to their sons. So in the family, the memory is fading, and because it's not prestigious and because it's quite dangerous memory. So finally, we get very common group of victims, which are really not the same. Now I came to the 80s. Okay. To the 80s, when something changed in the society. And maybe you can read the slogan. It's one of the meetings in Moscow. Do you understand it?
Is it like crimes, the crimes of Stalin are crimes against humanity?
Yeah, that's true. So this situation, when some of the topics are highlighted by state and by the culture, by all the mechanism of culture, which somehow select what should be remembered and what shouldn't be remembered, and the situation when you don't have any documents, you don't have any archives, and so on, access to the documents and to the archives. Was presented in Soviet culture and Soviet life till the late 80s, because during the liberalization of Gorbachev, first what he did, it was to provide the freedom of speech. And this freedom of speech finally buried the system itself. But this freedom of speech was very historicized. So people looked at the history and the idea of gaining back the history to the people who were real victims, for example, or who just lived in Soviet Union and never knew about what's happening with their relatives and during World War II, or in the camps of Gulag. Taking back this history became very popular and hot topic. And you can see it here, you can see it on the next slide, which shows one of the first meetings organized by Memorial. That's a movement which finally gathered all the people who want to do something about history in Soviet Union. I will just translate this. I think it's not very good recognizable. Memorial, it's a conscious, it's a memory, it's a knowledge, it's a pain, it's an archive, and the library, museum, and monument. So the idea was to get back your own history, to get access to the archives, and to provide the society with some institutions which could work as an independent institution and could work as a documentation center. And it was true for the story of political repressions, which is the main topic of Memorial, but it was also true for the Ostarbeiters. Because, okay, one more slide showing the story about how the protest is historicized. So the people came with social protest, but their slogans are about the past. The monopoly for the true is the Stalinism of our days. Coming back to Ostarbeiters, while discussing these omitted topics in the history of war and the history of Soviet past, once Sakharov, one of the founders of Memorial and Peace Nobel Prize winner from 1975, and also one of the physicists who invented hydrogen bomb and so on and so on. So he's quite important figure. He mentioned Ostarbeiters as one of the omitted topic, and then mentioned that these people should get some compensations from the state and from Germany, and then the reporter who took the interview with him wrote it and formulated as if Memorial itself would lobby the compensations in German government, and it was a mistake. But because of this mistake, around 320,000 letters came to Memorial with short explanation about where this person, the person who wrote it, where he or she worked in Germany, when he was deported to Germany, when he came back to the USSR, and when he or she is living now. Most of these documents were just simple blanks with small text, but I showed you before this came by, and around 12,000 documents which were held in the family archives. They also sent to Memorial, and that's why Memorial somehow began to be a center of commemoration of this topic, because no archives are open. The only archives, the only public, so the people just sent this and made this archive possible, and now it's public. The documents itself bear the signs of how they perceived in the families, and it's also interesting because if you look on this photo, it's a beautiful photo, very well done. It was done in Germany, but what is this? Do you have ideas?
A mark, something.
Hmm?
A mark of the commencement.
Yeah, it was, I can back it, this thing, and for example, this thing. It's a sign of that this person is Ostarbeiter, and it should be worn should be visible when you're going on the streets of Germany. But for the people who came with these photos back, it was also a sign that they were in Germany, which they wanted, for many of them didn't want to tell anybody. And it's also a sign of some humiliation, but the picture itself is good. And if we think about the people who were deported, it's mostly the villagers who never had the possibility to take a photo in normal Soviet village. And they have this photo from the youth, and they it was in the family, but with this part was scrapped out in order not to show the not pleasant part of the stories. So around 12,000 of the documents and the photographs also came by, and that makes Memorial the main remembrance center and one of the main partners of European institutions dealing with the history of Ostarbeiters, with the history of Soviet people which were in Germany. I didn't mention it's around 5 million, so it's a lot of people who were the Ostarbeiters. And if we came back about to the idea of meeting this topic in the Soviet culture, the only book which somehow reflects the fate of one of these 5 million people was published in 1978. It's quite strange. While being in Memorial, so because I'm Memorial, I'm responsible for the archive. While this was one of my first projects to try to publish this archive, and try to publish it not in a way which makes you so in a very reflective and educational way, by working with younger people, by working with school pupils and students, and so on. So we digitized the whole collection, we published it online on the website, and we made it we made several exhibitions which traveled all around Russia, and also were translated in German and in Belarusian. But what was, it's more or less my experience, and it's interesting how it worked, because when you have this cult of war with a very stable narration about heroic war, about who are the heroes and who are the victims, when you present to people who are not exposed to this kind of also propaganda, they begin to be exposed to in another way. So for the people who worked with me, and many of them came to us to work with the archive from older school pupils, the topic began to be very effective. So the only victims of the war are Ostarbeiters, and that's the most important topic in the world at all. So it really, it was very interesting, and still I hope it was quite reflective for them, because they, by reading the documents, by describing the documents, they could think of what they should do and how they could perceive it like 50 years ago, because they were dealing mostly with the documents made by the people the same age. So it's younger people who were forced to go to Germany, and basically the younger people who were describing the collection and digitizing it. And of course, I think it somehow worked in terms of educational work. But still it has some problems with this thing when you don't work on the history and the memory as a way to, when you don't consider it as a way to reflect your own society and your own past, but as a kind of dogmatic thing, it begin to work. It make all the work, historical work, very strange and very dangerous in terms of psychological consequences. We also published we published not only the memorial documents which were held in Memorial Archive, but also the documents from state archives. But it was very nice of working with state archive. They sell the documents to us for EV to publish it. We need to find the money to go to the state archives, and the state are okay, we will try to help you, just pay. We bought a lot of documents, we geocoded it, and finally get published a database of the most of the people who are mentioned in these documents, with good map and so on, and it was quite popular. So this topic began to be quite hot. So it was for first month more than 100,000 visitors on the website, with lots of questions about the relatives and so on. So it was somehow rediscovery of the topic for nowadays Russian. But the topic was also quite well received, because somehow this cult of war legalized other topics dealing with the war. Not the topic of repression, no, but the topic Ostarbeiters, okay, it's about war. You have nothing against Russian state on this moment of your existence. Okay, you can do it, and you can present it in the museums and so on. So it is one of the things which worked. But to conclude, I came with some ideas. I'm not sure that it's not very well developed now. So basically, maybe we can discuss it. Even I try to present to you different ways of commemorating of the history of World War II. First way, it's a state-sponsored way which deals with politicization. And which deals of omitting the person and personal reflection. The second way is culture, so with also a lot of problems. And the third way is NGO as a holder of this memory and how it works. I wouldn't say that we were it can be the work of Memorial with Ostarbeiters can be told, can be narrated as a history of success, but it's also, for me, it was a bit of history of failure, because the people who finally they get the same ideas about the war. So the people who worked with all the documents, but from another topic. So they begin very affected by the topic and very affected in a way which not helps you to reflect on it. So what is good, what is bad? Don't know. So, but and what is important, I would say that when the state provides very clear image of history, this clearance don't help to. It's very hard to avoid it, even when you take another topic, and it's really hard to avoid propaganda, and it's really hard to avoid the patterns of narrations which came out of TV, which came out of YouTube, from each media. And finally, when now reflecting about the whole program, I would say that trying to build our own narrative about Austria. So they did this narrative. Okay, we just published and we just worked with it, trying to build our own narrative. Finally, we were overwhelmed by the patterns which already existed and in huge media. But still, there is a hope. And this hope is the family memory, which unless I told you about this generational thing, which really don't help it to exist. But still, when people know about what, so we published tools to trace the history of repressed people, tools of tracing the history of Ostarbeiters. When the people can work with that memory, can work with that history, and it's easily achievable, somehow it will provide the diversity of opinions and the diversity of narrations, maybe in the future. And coming back to the war, which we started with, I would say everything is just to the war itself, because many of my relatives and many of friends are now already also exposed to this propaganda, and they declines any reasonable arguments why it's not working, why Ukraine could exist as a state, and why Russian army could be considered as a traitor on the Ukrainian soul. But now they are overwhelmed by the narration, and it's really hard to avoid it. Maybe in years it will become more calm, and it will work in a way in which I think our Ostarbeiter program works. That many people came with the questions, and many people came with as people who now, when the tools are working, they want to recreate the history of their family, and while recreating it, they will get some other different ideas of history, and of course of history of this world too. Yeah, I think I will end with this on this point.
Thank you. Thank you a lot, Nikita, for this, I would say, very intense also reflection about the role played by memory in different historical junctures. Actually, thinking about what you were talking, it came to my mind one fantastic book. I don't know, many of you had the chance to read also contemporary Russian literature by Maria Stepanova.
Yeah.
Pamyati Pamyati is a book that goes exactly about the role of family memory as a potential, we could say, trigger of a new understanding of contemporaneity, and also the difficulties in, we could say, reconstructing, we could say, a functional memory that could, in a sense, give you the perception that you can grasp what you are living in. There would be a lot of topics to mention, but before maybe making some comments, I will leave you the floor for your comments, for your ideas. I guess that actually I'm very glad to have him here. Nikita has come to Italy also to participate in several events all around Emilia-Romagna, as far as I understood, in Modena, especially, and in order to present the new activities conducted by Memorial, the members of Memorial International outside of the borders of the Russian Federation today. As far as you understood, Nikita worked mostly on the digitalization of the archives of memorials, so there is some hope that these materials can still play an important role for reconstructing a new understanding of the memory of the Soviet repressions. And I guess that a lot of topics could be touched by your comments, your questions. You really mentioned a lot of issues that I guess have been of great interest to us. While thinking about the reactualization of memory, as you were rightly mentioning before, in my experience as a researcher working mostly on Ukrainian society, culture, and politics, for example, since 2008, 2009, we witnessed a great wave of publications of the so-called Военная историческая фантастика. That is a kind of very specific genre of literature written mostly by authors who were born in Donbass, so especially in Donetsk, but also in, we could say, in Slobozhanщина, that is the Kharkiv region, who created this kind of alternative history. So projecting the history of the Second World War into a future where Ukraine will be invaded by Nazis and Russia will come to defend Ukraine from the Nazi attack. So in 2008, we had writers from this region who drafted this work, which were published by Russian publishing houses mainly, such as Yauza, that was very active in promoting such a kind of rhetoric. And what was interesting is that in 2014, when volunteers from the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic did fight back against Kiev, most of these writers became Minister of the Defense of the occupied territory or played an active role in the first political stage of this development. So as far as you can see, there is a kind of continuity while thinking about the reactualization of memory and how actually it can then play a concrete role in the political realm. And I guess this was something that came to my mind when you started to think about that. Another issue, so I'm going with my comments since I didn't see any specific reaction, but please feel free to intervene. About this idea that the state can offer different attempts, we would say, at persuading people in joining the state, we would say, narrative about the contemporary era, I would suggest you to watch a video that I guess all of you can find easily on YouTube. That is the New Year's Eve speech held by Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin at the turn of the millennium, we can say, where both Boris Yeltsin and Putin intervene, describing what had been the experience of the 90s in the Russian Federation, so the so-called wild 90s, and in a sense, Putin also drafting a document that was published in Nezavisimoya Gazeta and in some other important journals, newspapers of contemporary Russia, exactly described this kind of separation between the so-called wild 90s and the beginning of a new era, making a kind of tabula rasa of what had been the attempt of liberalizing Russia in the 90s. And I guess this is something that maybe could be of interest to you also while looking on the web and checking on the web. I guess that Filippo had the chance to watch together with me in one of our courses last year this speech that I guess is very, very effective and very important. What you refer to as something happening for Volgograd, who comes to be renamed as Stalingrad in recent time, in times of celebration, actually something that is happening in the occupied territories of Ukraine nowadays. For the Victory Day, the 9th of May this year, actually Lugansk was renamed for a day Voroshilovgrad. That was this Soviet name of the city at the times of the war, of course. And so was a city, of course, named after one of the major, we could say, generals of the Soviet army. And so you can understand also the meaningfulness of these steps that actually, in my experience as a scholar researching also the narratives emerging from the People's Republic, it was interesting to see how actually people were claiming to fight for the motherland, but actually what was this motherland was not so clear in as for the contemporary, we would say, voters of this motherland, since this motherland was mainly a reference to the past Soviet motherland, and I guess this is also something quite interesting. And finally, I would say about the role of archives. I guess this is a very, very important issue that maybe we could discuss more together, and maybe Nikita could tell us something more about that to us, because it is something that is usually overlooked in a sense So the role actually how selective memory can be constructed through the use of archives. And actually that is something that in recent months after the start of the war, I know that on Komsomolskaya Pravda, a kind of the Ministry of Defense is publishing some materials from the archives that actually narrate the stages of the Second World War that run in parallel to what is happening now in Ukraine, and selectively exactly present and comment on these documents in order to create a kind of a proper fit between the two dimensions. And I guess this is something that can already tell us a lot, and that's something that happened, for example, in Ukraine in the aftermath of the Maidan Revolution and the so-called decommunization policies. Actually, we did not witness only the renaming of streets or the so-called Leninopad, so the topple of Lenin's monuments, but also we witnessed the opening of archives. And this was a great event for Ukrainian society, since most of the people who were there to look for the story of their own relatives could finally get to the archives and to start researching about the history of their own families. And that's something that you can understand in this constant struggle for fighting against the silencing of memory is something that's enormous, that has a huge impact on society. Okay, I commented maybe too much, so I would leave you now the floor. I guess please feel free also to pose any question about the activity of Memorial International. It is not so easy to have a representative of Memorial International in Italy or with us in Forlì. Even I guess it is maybe actually Nikita has been in Forlì. He doesn't know how and why. But this is I guess the first time that we can discuss together about the activities of Memorial. So please feel free to intervene. I guess this could be a great opportunity.
Maybe I can add a bit about the archives, because
absolutely.
It's really,
I should check also if there is any reaction from you.
Okay. Because it's really the story of opening the archives in the Ukraine. It's like a small revolution. The archives were so the archives in Russia were open for researchers. I mean, archives dealing with the history of repressions were open for the researcher during the 90s, and then begin to suddenly close. And now it's only if you have if you have a relative, you can go to the archive and or ask the archive to send you the case of your relative repressed. And no archive will give you access to the whole case, because there is a lot of things which they don't want to show you and they don't want to publish. Basically, the idea behind it is that the archives are institutional, not the state archives, but institutional. And these archives are owned by the institution which inherits is heir to the institution dealing with the repression. So basically, if they show the names of the people, of the investigators, they expose themselves and the people who are working now also in this institution to the public. So when you get some document from Russian institutional archive, it's quite normal when the names are deleted from the scan. And when the archives in Ukraine opened, it was a revolution, because basically the Ukrainian archive has the copy of the most important documents. So you can get it in Russia, but you can get it in Ukrainian. It was very important. Dealing with the story of occupation, it's the same. Not so many archives are dealing with this history, but all of them are very conservative in terms of publishing the documents, and it's in terms of giving the copies with the names of the people who, for example, collaborated with the Germans. It is explained by the ideas of social peace and so on, but so it's still what shocked me when I ordered the documents from occupational territories, that they still don't want to show the names, and they still can tell you that okay, this page you can publish, but this not. And it's 75 years and 70 almost 80 years, and since then no publishing. And also it's about State Archive, and another point which is also interesting. It's the point about the Memorial Archive and the archive of NGOs, so-called grassroots archives, because Memorial Archive is made out of donations of the families. And of course, it's quite simple. It is quite simple to manipulate this archive. One good example is the story of Nina Gniewkowska. Just an example. It's a person who was arrested in late 40s and spent a couple of years in the camps. Then rehabilitated. That means that officially all the accusations were lifted and it was proclaimed as a mistake. And in the 90s, she wrote that she would be, she wanted to be a part of Memorial, and sent it to, and sent her announcement that she wants to be, and with some documents, with this rehabilitation thing, to the archive of Memorial. And it was held in our archive among the other many cases and documents. But there is not only this part of the story, there is another part of the story which was presented in another archive, also owned by Memorial. That's archive of the dissident movement of the people of human rights activists in late Soviet Union. And after coming back from the camps, she get juridical education, and she began to be a prosecutor. And she was one of the most famous prosecutors against human rights activists. So in the 60s and in the 70s, she prosecuted human rights activists. And for example, she was one of the prosecutors dealing with the demonstration of 1968, when several people came on the Red Square to protest against attack on Czechoslovakia, on occupying the Czechoslovakia. And she was one of the investigators. But in the 90s, she sent this. She sent some documents to us, and she sent this announcement. And for the archive of Memorial, she's of course a victim. For another part of the archive of Memorial and this dissident people, she's a prosecutor, and she absolutely not a victim. And she manipulates this thing and change her identity, first as a victim, of course, then as prosecutors, and once more as a victim in 1990. Then in early 2000s, she came out with some memories about her working as a good prosecutor against all these human rights activists who really don't care about human rights, but only about are under Western influence and working against Soviet Union. So it's really strange, and each of this representation can be documented in the archive, and that's quite tricky with or maybe.
Maybe it's a stupid question because there is a Western bias, but I wanted to ask regarding, let's say, the cult of war in Russia, regarding the parade of 9th of May, for example, because in the Western media this year, when there was a parade during the war in Ukraine, the situation was presented as a Russian army rushing to make some symbolic conquest, so to have a stronger appeal, let's say, for the people in Russia, I guess, during the parade of the 9th of May. And I think that they managed to do something in the sense. And I wanted to ask if you know how was the war in Ukraine used in the celebration of the 9th of May this year? If there is a way in which it entered the celebration of the 9th of May.
No, you know that almost nobody came to this celebration out of
exactly.
outer lands, and everybody were quite like I was there preparing for preparing to leave the Russia, and there was a lot of fear that they can do everything to just to end the war till the 9th of May. And even we had some rumors circulated that if you want to leave the Russia, you'd better do it before the 9th of May, because I never knew that something should happen. But finally, as far as I understand, they didn't. They decided not to. Not to help this topic. So were separate. One were separate from another. Yeah, but of course it was quite. It was so everybody waited for something and waited for some not mobilization, but for some huge attacks before the 9th of May, just to be to use symbolically this event to declare that we are victorious now and then.
But do you think that they didn't do it because it was not convenient?
It was not. It was because it was. So it's how they work with the things which they didn't achieve in Ukraine. That Putin shows that everything's all right. I just like the war. It's not a war. It's just a special military operation somewhere outside. If there is a good way to promote this idea, he will do it. But if there are some problems, he will do everything not dealing with the war and show himself as a economical administrator and so on and so on. And I would say that on the 9th of May, the situation wasn't so good to declare it as like to use it symbolically and to use it symbolically for the parade itself. Because parade should be it's a fest. It's something which is glorious, and nothing glorious is going on in the Ukraine.
Since your work, as far as I understood, is aims at building an alternative memory with respect to the future one. So when you, in the case of Osterwald as an example, I guess, because like they were not, I mean, their how they were treated was not didn't correspond to the ideal, you know, of USSR. So when you did your research, how was it easy to bring your research? I mean, as your research been brought into the public discourse, so was it easy to accept? Like even for like, I don't know, like widespread newspaper, for instance, did they talk about it? And how did like civil society, like in general, react to this alternative memory?
I would say that more or less it was quite well accepted and because it's not the main topic. It's not about the repression. It's the topic connected to the war. So it had a lot of public attention, and a lot of media and state media were quite sympathetic to the things we did, which completely was in contrast to the other work of Memorial. But this concrete topic was quite easy to get people around and to promote and to go on state media. So it's really strange, but it worked. And of course, what is also important that we were not the only one. I think it was one TV series about Ostarbeiter girl, which basically were shown at the same time when we had the exhibition. So it worked together. It worked together just to give some attention and publicity to the exhibition and to some of our websites. But when we published this archival materials from State Archive, there were almost no reaction from state media, and I think this is kind of success, that it was very well received on the smaller forums of people dealing with genealogy and with local history. So it wasn't PR from top to down, but it was PR from bottom to the top. So it worked very well, and yeah.
Because there were like different times as well, not nowadays. Like
Yeah.
It was kind of more acceptable, like, to put in question an official version of this.
But it's not something which opposites to official version of history. It's disregarded version of history. What we try to do is to make this topic more vivid and make this topic more reflective and put a person inside, not just documents. It's not like alternative in terms of oppositional. It wasn't so with, for example, when Memorial published a database of the people who were working in secret police in the 30s. It's around 20,000 names, and no state media mentioned it. But finally, the press secretary of president should say something, because he said, "Okay, that's controversial topic. Should you do it or shouldn't?" And in several days, the website were broken, and we put a lot of attempt to put it back online, but still it works. So it worked. And this memory of like publishing the names of prosecutors is really a positional kind of approach to the history. Ostarbeiters, they aren't.
Like maybe it's a bit out of topic, but still, a couple of years ago, I found on the internet several pictures about Germans, officials, soldiers from the war, that at the time, I think was like the 1970s, more or less, were still struggling inside the Gulag system. And I'd like to ask if Memorial has the opportunity, or now or in the past, to deal with their stories, or because I see pictures of them working like as janitors most of the time inside
You mean the Germans who were prisoners of war and came to Gulag? Mostly they returned to the early 50s. So yes, they worked a lot for as part of Gulag system. That was one way, or there was another types of camps, especially for them, and also another type of it's called trudarmia, so another type of forced labor troops used for basically for the construction of the building and for the reconstruction. But most of the Germans came back in the early 50s. Did we do something about them?
No, just
Yeah.
kind of curiosity.
Yeah, no, I don't think it was. It's still this topic is presented in the local museums quite well because it's very local thing of dealing with Germans who are here, and because it's mostly about the merciful of Russian people towards the Germans, which help them to live, which provides them with the food and so on. And this topic isn't hidden, and even it's a lot of talks when you speak of which buildings are done by Germans, and with some kind of it's like it's quite prestigious to live in the building which were done by Germans. But speaking of Germans in Soviet Union, it's also important to understand that there was a huge wave of migration of the 30s of the left-wing activists, left-wing architects, and so on, who went to Soviet Union. Many of them, for example, many of the Bauhaus school also moved to the Soviet Union. Some of them then moved out of this country. Some of them stayed. Some of them were arrested or put into exile. And for example, there is a city in Ural Mountains, Solikamsk, where the historical city center were restored by the German architect who were exiled in the 40s to the Solikamsk and worked there just a restoration worker. And that's not a story of confrontation between Germans and Russians, that's personally of collaboration.
Are there? Yes, please, Philippe.
I wanted to ask, it's quite off topic, but I wanted to ask why, in your opinion, Putin uses elements in his propaganda from the Imperial Russia, but at the same time he celebrates also the Soviet Union, the Soviet past. I think it's quite contradictory.
What do you mean about first empire propaganda? Could you explain a bit? What do you mean?
I mean, it tries also to celebrate both the imperial past and.
You mean Russian Empire before 1917? Ah, okay, yeah. Now I get it. He used, as I told, I think I'm not his prayer assistant, but basically the state used the resentment for Soviet Union in internal policy. Because people are really looking to the Soviet past, especially to the 70s, as a period when everything was fine, and it's also interesting for example, speaking of this essays of school contest, because the trauma of the 90s is very well presented there. So it's about poverty, it's about the Chechen war. So a lot of things happened in the 90s, and of course that's not a good period of time for the families. And also 80s are quite strange, because 80s with the reforms of Gorbachev are really not the best, and of course the Afghanistan war already was, so a lot of people were fighting in Afghanistan, and it's not the glorious period. But 70s with high prices of oil, with this stability and so on, and when the state, Soviet state was like, it's not communist of course, but comparing to nowadays Russia and to many capitalist cities, the division difference in the incomes of people were so small, so that you can really tell that you live in the society of the equals. And this idea is very well presented in the essays, also in the museum expositions, speaking of the story of 20th century, because the 70s is all are presented in most of the local museum I've seen as happy childhood. So some things which connects, which are connected to the child, and it's not about the war. Nothing bad is happening. So he used this Soviet resentment just as a way to tell that we are going and we want to make a social state. We want to repeat the success of Soviet Union in creating this social state, and this imperial past. I would say it's quite strange, because Soviet Union wasn't very well in terms of ceremonial. So basically, you know, of course, the parade was established, but all the ceremonial of power is inherited from Soviet Empire, from Russian Empire. Basically, when Stalin began to present himself as a leader of the nation, he didn't use this Bolshevik. He was more a Tsar, more than a Bolshevik leader like Lenin. And all this imperial fashion, imperial poverty. So it is presented in the architecture. It's everywhere. So when you want to show the power, symbolism of authority, symbolism of power, the first thing which came to mind is the Russian Empire thing, because of this long tradition of imperial thinking, because of this long tradition of establishing a ceremonial which is very well understood by the people all around. Then because the architecture itself, Moscow Kremlin, it's imperial architecture. Petersburg is imperial architecture. So basically you are doomed to continue this tradition in terms of like, so not in way of content, but in way of visible representation. So I would say that in terms of content, he makes a stake on Soviet resentment. In terms of visibility, he really used this imperial patterns of presenting its power. And it is very well, if you will look at the inauguration ceremony of presidents, it's very well seen how they use the reconstructed imperial interiors and how they repeat many of the parts of the ritual which were important for Romanovs, for the Russian emperors during the coronation. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you a lot, Nikita. Thank you all for being here today.